Imagine opening your eyes after fighting for your life, only to realize the first face you see, the man who saved you, the man your heart quietly chose, belongs to someone who is hours away from marrying someone else. From the very first moment she was wheeled into the emergency room, drifting in and out of consciousness, she sensed, through the haze of fear, a voice that anchored her to life. It wasn't the words themselves she remembered later, but the tone, steady, calm, almost stubbornly determined to keep her alive. She was too weak to open her eyes, yet she could feel that voice pulling her back from the edge, giving her something to hold on to when everything else felt like darkness rushing in. She had never seen him before, never known his name, yet somehow his presence wrapped around her like a promise that she would not be abandoned. At a time when she had nothing, not her strength, not her clarity, not even her own breath, he became the reason she fought. And that was where gratitude began, quietly and unexpectedly. As the days blurred into nights, she became more aware of the hands that checked her pulse, adjusted her oxygen, and gently reassured her even when her body was too battered to respond. Each time she woke up frightened, gasping, lost in panic, he appeared beside her, his face a lighthouse in the storm of pain. She remembered the exhaustion in his eyes, the faint shadows on his jaw from sleepless shifts, and the way he never rushed her through her fear. He spoke to her as if she were fully present, fully deserving of patience and dignity, even when she couldn't speak a single word back. And she realized then that gratitude wasn't just about survival. It was about feeling seen, valued, protected at her most vulnerable. It was about someone believing in her strength long before she rediscovered it herself. When she finally regained enough clarity to take in the world around her, she found herself observing him in fragments. How he always greeted nurses with respect, how he explained procedures to her with gentle thoroughness, how he never made her feel like a burden. She watched him move through the ward with a quiet confidence, a steadiness that made the room feel safer just because he was in it. She admired the way he carried responsibility, not as a duty, but as a calling. There was an undeniable warmth beneath his professionalism, a human softness that slipped through whenever he encouraged her, or when he adjusted her blanket to keep her warm. Those small gestures had a way of stitching her heart back together, sometimes more effectively than the medicine itself. And slowly, gratitude began to deepen, not into dependence, but into connection. There were moments, she later realized, when she felt herself anticipating his arrival. When he walked into the room, she felt a shift in the air, as though the weight she carried grew lighter, as though the pain receded just a little. She found comfort in the sound of his footsteps approaching, in the certainty that he would notice if she was struggling, in the quiet sincerity with which he asked how she felt. She didn't plan for her heart to attach itself to the man who fought for her life. It simply happened. It happened in the stillness between breaths, in the fragile hours of dawn when she woke trembling and saw him watching over her, making sure she was safe. Gratitude, she learned, could bloom into something far more tender when given soil made of vulnerability and hope. Eventually, as her condition improved and her mind cleared, she began noticing details she had been too weak to see before, the slight tilt of his smile when she made progress, the concentration in his eyes as he reviewed her scans, the way his voice softened whenever he addressed her fears. She found herself wanting to know more about him, not as a doctor, but as a person. What did he dream of? What made him laugh? What weighed on him after long, grueling nights at the hospital? She never asked, of course. Her role was the patient, his was the healer. Yet her heart moved beyond that boundary silently, invisibly. She cherished the care he offered, treasured the kindness he gave so freely, and held every moment like a fragile gift. It was gratitude, yes, but layered with emotion she struggled to name. And somewhere between the pain and the healing, between the whispered reassurances and the quiet companionship of his presence, she realized the truth she never spoke aloud. She had begun to love him. Not in the dramatic, consuming way stories describe, but in a gentle, unspoken way that grew from trust and admiration. She loved him because he saved her life, but also because he made her feel human again when she felt reduced to her suffering. She loved him because he reminded her that the world still held goodness. But most of all, she loved him silently, because she believed that some feelings are too delicate, too sacred, to be spoken out loud. And so her love stayed where it began, tucked between gratitude and hope, unacknowledged, yet undeniably real. From the earliest hours of her arrival, even before her family was notified or her condition was fully diagnosed, the doctor made her case a personal mission. He didn't see her as another file in the overcrowded ward or as another patient added to his exhausting shift. He saw a life on the edge, and he refused to let it slip away. The hospital was loud that night, machines beeping, nurses rushing, stretchers sliding across the floor. But to him, she was the center of the storm he was determined to calm. He monitored her vitals himself when he could have easily assigned the task to someone else. He stayed beside her during the first critical hours when every second counted, adjusting medications, reviewing scans, making decisions with the precision of someone who understood the weight of each breath she struggled to take. His dedication wasn't loud or heroic. It was steady, relentless, and deeply human. Colleagues often whispered that he worked harder than the job required. During a treatment, she saw why. He wasn't the kind of doctor who walked in only with charts and clinical detachment. He carried empathy into every room he entered. He listened when she whispered that she was scared, even though he had heard the same fear from countless patients. He reassured her each time her chest tightened, explaining what was happening in words she could understand. When she trembled in pain, he didn't rush the conversation or give rehearsed lines. He spoke with a sincerity that made her believe him. He didn't just treat her body, he treated the fear that lived inside her. That was the kind of dedication only a rare kind of healer possessed. The kind who understood that recovery wasn't just physical. It was emotional, spiritual, fragile. There were nights when he could have gone home, nights when his shift ended hours before he actually left, but he stayed. He sat beside her bed reviewing her charts long after the rest of the staff had changed shifts. Sometimes she would open her eyes at odd hours, 2 a.m., 3 a.m., 4 a.m., and she would see him walking quietly from room to room, checking on patients like a guardian moving through the dimly lit corridors. When he reached her bed, he always paused a little longer, adjusting her Roman 4, feeling her pulse, making sure she was stable. She wasn't conscious enough at the time to thank him, but she noticed his consistency, his almost stubborn refusal to let exhaustion interfere with his care. She realized later that dedication wasn't always heroic. Sometimes it was the quiet repetition of choosing responsibility over rest. He also had a way of shielding her from the worst parts of her condition. When test results came back aggressive or complications arose, his voice never betrayed panic. Even when the uncertainty was heavy, he carried it alone, refusing to let it crush her spirit. He read her every expression, every small shift in her breathing, every flicker of pain. She was too weak to speak. He asked questions she could answer with the slightest nod. If her eyes filled with tears, he paused, giving her a moment before speaking, because he understood that healing required space, patience, and trust. He treated her not as a case number, but as a human being whose life mattered deeply. That dedication created a bond she hadn't expected, a subtle but powerful connection born from the care he gave so tirelessly. As she grew stronger, she began to understand the magnitude of the effort he had invested in her recovery. Nurses told her how many nights he had stayed past his shift, how he had personally monitored her when her condition took sudden declines, how he had refused to give up even when the odds were stacked against her. She overheard one nurse saying, if it weren't for him, she wouldn't be here. Those words carved themselves into her heart, not because she owed him her life, but because he had chosen to fight for her life with a kind of dedication that exceeded duty. It was then that she realized the truth. The doctor hadn't just saved her body, he had fought for her future. And in witnessing his dedication day after day, she found herself admiring him in ways she could never articulate. She admired the calm steadiness he brought into chaos. She admired the way he spoke with gentleness even when he was exhausted. She admired the humanity that radiated through his work, the compassion, the discipline, the loyalty he showed to his patients. His dedication was not a performance. It was a reflection of the person he was. And though she never said it aloud, it was that dedication that rooted his presence so deeply into her heart. Through his care, He became more than the man who saved her life. He became the quiet source of strength she had held onto without even realizing it. When she finally woke up after days of drifting in and out of sedation, the world felt unfamiliar, as though she were experiencing it through a fragile layer of glass. The ceiling lights were too bright, the room too quiet, her breath too shallow. She blinked slowly, trying to anchor herself to reality. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was or why her body felt so heavy. The hospital walls loomed around her like strangers. She turned her head slightly, and that was when she saw him, not as a blurred shape or a distant voice, but clearly, as though her sight had sharpened just to meet him. He stood at the foot of her bed, reading her chart, unaware that she had awakened. In that instant of clarity, something inside her shifted. It wasn't dramatic, but it was powerful, like a soft but undeniable spark that flickered to life after weeks of darkness. Her throat was dry, her voice barely a whisper, but the first word she managed to form was his name. She didn't remember learning it. She didn't remember when he had told her. It had simply lodged itself in her mind during the blurry hours of survival. When he heard her voice, he looked up quickly, almost with disbelief, and then with relief that softened his features. That expression, raw, genuine, unguarded, broke something open inside her. She had seen many faces while she was fighting for her life, but his was the one she always sensed, even when she couldn't see. And now that her vision had finally caught up with her heart, she felt an emotion rise in her chest that she wasn't prepared for. Gratitude, yes, but more than that. It was as if waking up meant waking to him. He stepped closer, speaking her name gently, asking how she felt, adjusting her pillows with hands that moved with both expertise and tenderness. She tried to answer, but the moment he stood beside her bed, her breath seemed to catch. She studied every detail. The careful crease of concern between his eyebrows, the soft way he held her wrist to check her pulse, the way he lowered his voice as if afraid to overwhelm her. She felt an inexplicable warmth bloom inside her, swollen with so many unspoken things. She didn't understand it at first. She only knew that his presence made her feel safe in a world that had been frightening for far too long. Slowly, this feeling began to connect the scattered pieces of her memory, forming a picture she hadn't fully seen until now. Over the next hours, as nurses moved in and out, she remained strangely aware of him. Her gaze followed him without meaning to. Each time he returned to check on her, her heart fluttered with a quiet intensity she didn't know how to contain. She found herself anticipating his footsteps, recognizing his silhouette even before he spoke. When he placed a hand on her shoulder to reassure her during a painful shift, she closed her eyes, not because of the discomfort, but because his touch made her realize how deeply she trusted him. She realized then that her emotional awakening was not a sudden explosion, but a gentle unveiling. It was the first time she allowed her heart to feel something beyond fear. It was the first time she realized that survival had given her back not just life, but emotion. As the hours turned into a full day, she noticed how her feelings grew more defined. Whenever he entered the room, she felt a softness in the air that wasn't there before. When he spoke, she listened not just to the words, but to the calm rhythm of his voice. When he explained her progress, she watched his eyes instead of the charts. She found herself replaying the memories she barely had, his voice guiding her through panic, his hands steadying her, his silhouette standing guard during long nights. Those fragments now aligned with the man standing in front of her, and the realization made her chest tighten. She cared for him, deeply, unexpectedly, maybe even irrationally, but it was real. This emotional awakening didn't come with fireworks or grand declarations. It came with quiet moments, the kind that stitched themselves into her heart without asking permission. She understood now why her body had fought to wake up despite the pain. She understood why his voice had anchored her when everything else felt like drowning. The awakening was not just about gaining consciousness. It was about recognizing the invisible bond formed in the silent spaces between life and loss. And though she didn't dare speak it, she knew the truth. The doctor who saved her life had become the keeper of her heart. A heart now fully awake, fully aware, and quietly longing for something she wasn't sure she was allowed to feel. When the fog in her mind finally lifted enough for her to understand the passing days, she asked the nurse what time it was. what day it was, how long she had been unconscious. The nurse smiled gently, brushing her hair back from her forehead, and told her she had woken up on a very special morning. At first, she didn't think much of it. Every day felt special when you had nearly lost your life. But the nurse's expression carried a softness that made her curious. She waited for an explanation, expecting perhaps a holiday, maybe an event at the hospital. Instead, the nurse said something that made her heartbeat stumble, something she wasn't prepared to hear. "It's Dr. Amir's wedding day." The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. She blinked, uncertain she had heard correctly. A strange numbness spread through her chest, like her body was rejecting the information even as her mind absorbed it. At first, her reaction was confusion rather than pain. She struggled to reconcile the person she had connected with so deeply, the man who had been by her side in her darkest hours, with the reality that he had a life outside the dimly lit hospital room. A life full of commitments, plans, love. A life that had nothing to do with the quiet emotions she carried in her heart. She had been wrapped in her gratitude, her admiration, her secret affection, and it had made her forget that he belonged to other worlds, worlds where she did not exist. As she processed the nurse's words, she felt something inside her shift, as though the ground beneath her heart had tilted without warning. She didn't know what to feel or what she was allowed to feel, but the truth pierced her like a quiet blade. The man she had come to love was hours away from promising his life to someone else. The nurse continued speaking, telling her how hard he had worked in the days before, how he had been torn between concern for her and preparation for his wedding. She listened numbly, every detail deepening her understanding of the emotional distance she had never noticed before. She felt foolish, and yet she couldn't help the ache blooming inside her chest. She wasn't angry at him. How could she be? He had saved her life, cared for her with devotion, and treated her with compassion. None of that had been a promise, but her heart had mistaken it for possibility. Now, reality stood before her like a mirror she had no choice but to look into. And in that reflection, she saw the quiet truth she had tried to ignore. While she had been awakening to him, he had been preparing to belong to someone else. She stared at the ceiling, trying to calm the tide of emotions rising within her. A painful warmth prickled behind her eyes, not the kind of grief that comes from betrayal, but the gentle heartbreak that comes from learning you were never meant to be part of a story you wrote in silence. She imagined him in another room of the hospital, possibly reviewing patients one last time before leaving for the ceremony. She pictured him adjusting his tie, receiving congratulatory messages, smiling in ways she had never seen because those smiles belonged to another part of his life. She wondered about the woman he was marrying, what she was like, what he loved about her, what promises they had made to each other. Each thought pressed deeper into the bruise forming inside her heart, a bruise made not of anger but of loss for something that never even began. Every footstep outside her door made her wonder if he would come in one last time before leaving. And with that hope came another wave of pain, because she knew she had no right to expect anything. She hated how fragile her heart felt, how her fingers trembled against the bed sheet, how her breath caught each time she imagined him walking down the aisle. She tried to remind herself that her feelings had grown in silence, nurtured by vulnerability rather than reality. But emotions, once born, do not disappear out of obedience. They linger, cling, ache. Her mind understood the truth, but her heart refused to release the quiet longing it had carried through the darkness of her recovery. And so she lay there, torn between gratitude and grief, feeling both humbled and heartbroken by the discovery. What hurt the most was not that he was getting married. It was that she had woken up just in time to know, but far too late for it to matter. She had imagined telling him thank you with the fullness of her heart, imagined sharing the depth of her appreciation with him, not as a confession, but as closure. But now, even gratitude felt complicated. She felt as though she had walked into a story whose last chapter had already been written without her knowledge. And though she didn't speak it aloud, she understood one simple, painful truth. Sometimes the moment you open your eyes is the same moment life gently reminds you that some dreams are not meant to be chased. The discovery broke her quietly, leaving her suspended between the woman she had been while fighting for her life and the woman she now had to become. As the truth of his wedding day settled inside her like a slow, falling weight, she realized she had a choice to make. Her heart, fragile and freshly awakened, urged her to cling to the emotions that had bloomed in secret. It whispered that she should call him, ask him to come, tell him everything she had felt in the darkness, the fear, the gratitude, the unspoken affection. But another part of her, deeper and steadier, reminded her of something she had learned in the hardest moments of her recovery. Strength was not always loud. Sometimes strength was choosing silence. Sometimes dignity meant protecting your own heart by not placing it in a place it could never belong. She closed her eyes and breathed slowly, letting that truth settle. She had survived pain far greater than heartbreak. She could survive this too. When the doctor finally entered her room, still in his hospital scrubs, unaware that she knew, she watched him with a new understanding. His smile was gentle, relieved to see her awake and stable, and for a moment she felt the familiar warmth rise in her chest. But beneath that warmth, there was an ache she was learning to master. She listened as he explained her progress, his tone calm, professional, and sincere. There was no hesitation in his voice, no hidden message for her to interpret. He cared for her deeply, yes, but only in the way a healer cares for the people entrusted to him. She forced herself to see that clearly, without the haze of emotion. She answered him calmly, her voice steady despite the turbulence beneath. She did not mention what she had learned. She did not let her eyes linger too long. She let dignity guide every word. Every instinct inside her wanted to hold on to him for just a little longer, to tell him how much his care had meant, how his presence had kept her anchored to life when she wanted to drift away. But she knew that speaking from emotion now would not only complicate his life, but would rob her of the quiet strength she was trying to build. Love, she realized, wasn't always about declaring. Sometimes it was about restraining. She chose to be grateful without being selfish. She chose to cherish what he had done for her without demanding anything in return. She chose to acknowledge her feelings quietly, privately, because she understood one simple truth. Love that is born from vulnerability should never become a burden to the one who helped you stand again. After he left the room, she allowed herself a long moment to feel everything she had suppressed during his visit. The ache, the longing, the disappointment, they all rose inside her like a tide she could no longer hold back. Tears filled her eyes, not because she was angry at him, but because she was proud of herself, proud for staying composed, proud for honoring his happiness without letting her own emotions spill into his world, proud for choosing a path that allowed her to heal without damaging what had meant so much to her. The tears she shed were not tears of weakness, but of courage. They were the tears of someone learning to let go with grace. In the quiet of her hospital room, she began to realize that dignity was not a cold, distant thing. It was soft, it was gentle, it allowed her to feel without collapsing, it allowed her to grieve without regretting. She repeated silently to herself that her feelings were real, but they did not require a response. She had loved him in a space where love was safe in her thoughts, in her gratitude, in the moments when his voice brought her back to life. That love had served its purpose. It had given her strength during her darkest hours, and now dignity would guide her through the heartbreak that followed. Her story with him didn't need to be changed. It only needed to be accepted for what it truly was. As she lay there, staring at the faint rays of daylight entering through the blinds, she made a promise to herself, not to forget him, not to erase what she felt, but to honor her own heart by moving forward. She realized that strength was not always about holding on. More often, it was about letting go gracefully, quietly, without bitterness. She chose to see herself not as someone who lost love, but as someone who learned the depth of her own resilience. And in that moment, she understood that dignity was a form of self-love, a love she needed now more than ever. In the days that followed, she found herself reflecting not just on the doctor, but on everything she had experienced, from the fear of dying, to the fragile spark of hope he had given her, to the quiet heartbreak of waking up on his wedding day. Each memory felt heavy, yet strangely valuable. She realized that life had taught her something profound in a way she never expected. Not all love was meant to be reciprocated, and not all gratitude was meant to evolve into a shared future. Sometimes, the purpose of a person in our life is not to stay forever, but to remind us of something we had forgotten about ourselves: our strength, our worth, our capacity to feel deeply even after being broken. She learned that the doctor had been a mirror, showing her not who he was to her, but who she still was within herself. Before her illness, she had lived her life in pieces, too busy to pause, too overwhelmed to breathe, too lost to acknowledge her own heart. But lying in that hospital bed, held together by machines, uncertainty, and whispered reassurances, she had rediscovered the softer parts of herself, the parts capable of trust, the parts capable of affection, the parts capable of wanting something beyond survival. Her feelings for the doctor, though unreturned, had opened a door she didn't know existed, a doorway back into her own emotional depth. She realized that her ability to care for him was proof that her spirit had not been destroyed by the hardships she endured. It had simply been waiting for a reason to rise again. She began to understand that the doctor's role in her life was not meant to be romantic. It was meant to be transformative. He had given her a second chance at life, yes, but he had also given her something far greater, a reminder that she still had the capacity to connect, to hope, to feel something powerful even in the shadow of pain. His presence had awakened her heart, not to cling to him, but to awaken herself. She no longer saw her love as a wound, she saw it as a turning point, a quiet, delicate lesson written in unspoken moments. A reminder that love does not need to end in possession to be meaningful. She also learned something about bravery, not the kind that faces physical danger, but the kind that faces emotional truth. It took courage to acknowledge her feelings, even if they led to heartbreak. It took courage to let him go without bitterness. It took courage to hold on to gratitude without expecting anything more. She had loved him silently, but she had released him with even greater silence. In doing so, she discovered a strength she didn't know she possessed. The strength to protect her own heart without closing it. The strength to love without needing a reward. The strength to feel deeply without falling apart. It was a kind of emotional maturity she had never been forced to learn until now. As she recovered, she realized that moving forward didn't mean erasing what had happened. It meant carrying the lesson with her in a way that shaped her, not in a way that haunted her. She no longer saw the doctor as the man she lost. She saw him as the man who unknowingly guided her back to herself. She saw the wedding day revelation not as cruelty, but as clarity, a moment that taught her to differentiate between longing and destiny. She understood that some people are meant to pass through our lives to shift something inside us, to ignite a spark, to heal a wound we didn't realize was still open. His presence was not meant to be permanent, but it was meant to be powerful. And as she lay in bed one quiet morning, watching sunlight stretch across the room, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of peace. Not because the pain was gone, but because she had stopped fighting it. She allowed herself to feel, to understand, to grow. The deeper lesson was not about losing him. It was about finding herself, finding strength in soft places, finding meaning in moments that didn't last, finding courage in quietly broken hearts. She learned that the greatest love stories are sometimes the ones we live alone, stories that do not end with a promise, but with a transformation, stories that begin with another person, but ultimately lead us back to our own soul. In the weeks that followed, as her body grew stronger and her mind steadied, She found herself walking a path she never expected to take. She carried her feelings quietly, like a folded letter she never sent. There were moments when she wondered what if, moments when her heart stung with the softness of memory, but she no longer felt broken by it. She understood now that love, even when unreturned, could still be a source of healing rather than hurt. One afternoon, as she prepared to leave the hospital for the last time, she paused at the end of the hallway, the same hallway where she had first woken to the truth of his wedding day. The walls felt different now, lighter somehow, as if her acceptance had loosened the weight she once carried. She looked toward the ward where he was likely working, saving another life, guiding another soul away from darkness. She didn't turn back, didn't search for him, didn't try to catch one last glimpse. Instead, she whispered a simple thank you into the silence. Not a thank you for what might have been, but for what had been. Then she stepped outside, feeling the sun warm her skin, feeling life stretch open in front of her with possibilities she had never imagined before. She realized she wasn't leaving with emptiness. She was leaving with clarity. Her heart, once fragile, now beat with a quiet resilience born from loss, gratitude, and growth. She knew she would love again someday, but this time she would walk into love not as someone saved, but as someone whole. And as she took her first confident breath of fresh air, she understood one final truth. The man who saved her life would always be part of her story, but she, finally, had become the author of what came next.